Thank you so much for such a wonderful presentation, and even your book is very interesting. Thank you so much, because I have so much to learn from the China experience. I work on India, so I come from India. So there are two questions, but the first question is about, I want to understand the role of the non-state actors, because the agency that is being articulated in your book and also your presentation is about the state agency as well as the agency in relation to the state in many sense. Yeah. So in India, of course, here in the West also, I think we see that an offspring of the ICT development and the rise of a new entrepreneurial class is a new practice of microfinance. It has touched the bottom, not through the state, but through other things, through other mechanisms. As C.K. Prahlad, the management guru, calls it, profit at the bottom of the pyramid, which is a very big, very huge success. So another practice is to popularize ICT at the bottom level through corporate actors, ICT for governance, and often this is framed within the idea of corporate benevolence and also the industry's own insecurities about reproducing skilled labor.
Yes.
So there are two motives behind that. So do you see such practices in China also? And how has this complicated, if at all you see such practices, how has this complicated class and social relations? That's question number one. The question number two is about the model of global integration. Do you see any merit at all in this model that's proposed by Michael Caine and others? Because some of the empirical details that they provide seem to match with what we see in Bangalore. Do you see any merit in this model?
Okay, I want to go second question first. Of course, there's very important, there's merit, definitely. The focus on the second question, right? What I try to do is bring in more, the broader social picture in that focus, in our industry-focused analysis. So I don't think these two are contradictory. It's just, a matter of focus, in the sense that, the creative industry and not literature, the little I know, or Michael Caine's work, focus more on the industry as such, and focus more on the internal operations of this industry, move from different forms, formats, institutions, more kind of institutional analysis. What I want to bring in is the content and the social dimension. So I'm not dismissing that work at all. I think it's very important for that description, but I'm trying to have a broader social picture, because you can have, this statist project of early on ICT mobilization, now cultural industry mobilization. But then, if some protests break up in the countryside, then that's going to shift or actually undermine or in a way distract the state from continuing to pursue that. So the broader national politics, the different social classes and their stakes in the overall development must be brought into bear in the analysis. So what I think I'm doing is really, in that sense, complementary. I just try to broader social historical picture. In terms of the first question, I gather you were saying that the kind of more bottom-up aspect, right? And then also the corporate responsibility. And in the case of China, yes, there are those aspects too. Although I think there's a much difference that is in India, you have more of those NGOs and bottom-up civil society efforts, whereas in China, it's more statist. But then the corporations were also, they also have their problem with legitimacy. That is, after all, they are supposed to be state enterprises, even China Mobile, China Telecom, all that. So they were supposed to be also responsible for a more even distribution of telephone services. So when the state mobilized them, the state basically, yes, mobilized the socialist rhetoric to shame them, to force them into providing this. And also in the Chinese case, actually, it's not just the central state. So you also have different level local states that were involved. And in terms of local entrepreneurs, of course, many people, for example, make a living by serving as the provider of telephone services, like prepaid phone, everything, and actually talk about that. There's a wonderful book that's going to forthcoming by Jack Q, who talk about working class ICTs. So he basically do field work in a Shenzhen neighborhood and look at how this floating of ICT technologies into the working class neighborhood is happening, and the dynamics of local entrepreneurs. So again, I think this is, the specific ways of how it works might be different, but there's definitely that parallel there. So it's more a layered situation rather than, just the haves, have-nots. It's in Jack Q's idea, the have less. Yeah.
Just to follow up on your analysis of the successful repression of the Tiananmen Square uprising, and your kind of, I guess, a bit of a Scotch pole analysis of the lack of today of a split in the ruling classes, basically, that prevents the significant mobilizations in the countryside or in the urban periphery from finding access to the state. And to tie it into the question of nationalism and increasing nationalism and emphasis on harmony. In Africa and the Middle East, when international agencies or NGOs push for human rights, there's been a problem in the last 10 or 20 years that's often been very useful for the state to reconsolidate its nationalist credentials against human rights actors, against international political critique, and to further repress or to organize itself in vis-a-vis domestic conflict or domestic dissent. So I'm just wondering, is there a way strategically we, outside of China or involved in human rights movements, can think of a way to talk about human rights in China that doesn't facilitate this nationalist consolidation of the ruling classes, and that actually can somehow highlight possible splits in the ruling classes that obviously must be there in a society as complex and economically changing as China?
That's a wonderful question. I think I want to take that question. I don't know how to answer it. I think that question should be a discussion question later on in the session. What about that? I think it is apparently, right? Because I have no answer what you can do, because what I want to point is indeed precisely, the kind of Tibet protests, for example, against Tibet, vis-a-vis Tibet Olympic saying that torch relay thing, I'm going to talk backfire. So it kind of consolidates state power. And so how you can do it without lead to that kind of realliance. It's a very important. I guess it depends on how you pick issues, how you because again, with the Olympics, I have heard that the Chinese customs office officials stop a bunch of Bibles on the board and say, we're just taking care of it. Well, it depends on how you select your venues of intervention. Are you going to bring Bibles to save the Chinese, or are you going to do something different, right? So I guess it's a means and channels of intervention. And I think that's very important. It's always been one of my appeals, for example, during UDC meetings or talk about democratic communication, democratization, say, I beg people, don't forget about China and don't forget about the role of Western intellectuals, what you can do to build that kind of transnational solidarity without fit into the Chinese state and provoke nationalistic backlashes. So it's a question I haven't thought much. I've done myself, in different ways, but I think this question really deserves discussion. What about that? Yeah, thank you very much. And I guess, this is again a question that's more relevant to you and me, because what we can do. And
yes, thank you so much for that. It was an incredible crash course on Chinese history and culture. For someone as ignorant as me, it was great. The question I want to ask is about the meso level of analysis, because your critique is targeting the macro level of analysis.
Right.
And then your faith utopia is at the very micro level of analysis. So I want to target the meso, and maybe this is a question you are going to address later on when you address the national sphere that you said had left out. So if that is the case, I'll be happy to wait until later on this afternoon. But the question has to do, so then with the meso level, okay? Mm-hmm. I come from a country, Chile, where some of the critique that you were deploying has been used to criticize the macro numbers. The export-oriented economy has worked. The country trade balance is in favor of Chile. The country is exporting capital, is exporting creative industries, content, etc., etc., etc. Mm-hmm. At the meso and micro level, though, the numbers don't reflect that level of wealth, because the one thing that has also increased is social inequality.
Right.
Chile being one of the most unequal countries in the world now. So that development can happen while social inequality actually increases. So I buy that part of your argument. The part I'm curious about is the way in which the meso level is absent. That is to say, if one is to think of creative industries and their role in development, and IT in general and their role in development, is there a meso national level, not export-oriented, but China-based level at which you would want to comment something? Because certainly the newspaper seller or the old person singing Chinese opera of the classical kind in a park, which you stated is outside the logic of the state and the logic of the market, they are not going to change China.
No.
So if anything is going to happen, is because the wealth created by the macro numbers will at some point begin to be reflected at the meso national level.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate, because that's exactly, I think, what my book is about. Because I analyze the different sectors of the Chinese cultural industry. I analyze the domestic entrepreneurs, private sector. So and you are perfectly right, when I, in this presentation, I bring in the bird's eye world, perspective. And also, for the purpose of this, it's always, like Zhang Yimou show you some pictures, which end up being the micro level, everyday level. But I think, yes, the meso level is where the key aspect of analysis has to be. How many jobs have been created in the IT industry, how, which sector is open up, which sector is not, and that's exactly my book is about. So I appreciate your point, and as I say, that's actually, as I say, the most. And also later in my analysis, actually, I want to point out that at this point, I'm not sure we can make a conclusion yet. China has made it or not, because you never know when China is going to make it. And like the Chinese case is so similar in the Chilean with this Chilean case. Also, after all, Chile is one of the countries that's the early birds in neoliberal reform, right? So you can have development, and you also have inequality, and it's not an either-or situation. So in that sense, I think, talk about old-fashioned, I think we need to be careful of simply by the dependency theorist. But at the same time, we should move beyond the celebrationist neoliberal model. And so the key is in the middle, and it's on this tipping point. And at this point, I'm not willing to write off China's possibility of make it yet. Although the question then is, so what? For whom, right? But I really appreciate your point, because that's, I think, where the important is. And that's where also, like what I said earlier, the kind of analysis that Michael King is doing or others were doing is important, because you focus on the actual industry and how it performs.
Yeah, mine's more of a comment, really, but I loved your presentation, and I was really struck, although it was about a specific place and in a specific time and a history of China, by the points of contact between what was happening in China and what we've been talking about last week, and even my own experience in somewhere like the UK that you'd think would be very different. And the things that I noted down were the sort of depoliticizing of politics, which you explained as a consequence of the Cultural Revolution, and you could argue in the West as a consequence of the end of the Cold War and the unchallenged hegemony of capitalism. But that kind of depoliticizing, I thought, was a really common factor across places. Mm-hmm. The focus on the kind of privileging of urban areas against rural areas, which is a kind of market-driven effect, in a sense, in the West, and a policy-led initiative in China. The really interesting issue you brought up about class prejudice, which we've sort of talked about inequality, but we haven't actually talked about kind of class prejudice as much in these kind of debates. And I think you find this a lot. I mean, there's a celebration in creative industries rhetoric about popular culture, but not about working class culture.
Yeah.
It's a really important distinction, I think. In fact, one of my favourite sort of quotes on this area comes from an Australian report of 2002, which was it was a kind of Florida-inspired piece of work looking at the development of creative industries in Australia, which quotes, where concentrations of the working class exist, comma, the requisite locational characteristics to attract the creative class are absent. This is from the Australian Local Government Association. Effectively, here we have lots of working class people will put off the creative class. I think that element of prejudice and even hatred,
Right.
I think is very important, as well as just inequality.
Exactly.
Increasing inequality, obviously a factor, and I think inequality recreated as difference, as you say. I think that's very common across a lot of these debates. And finally, this issue of culture becomes creative industries, becomes creativity. And all of that is about the lack of a problematic. Culture is inherently problematic. Creative industries have some problematics, and creativity is just a good thing.
It's just a good thing, pure.
And absolutely.
Exactly.
I think all those points were really, really, useful and well brought out, but really common across different situations.
Yeah, that's why, when I was reading your paper, I said, actually, in the end, UK and China were not that different. After all, China has joined the world. China has caught up with neoliberalism. And so, because the subjective and the objective dimension of class. It's not just inequality, but it's the subjective articulation and also the refusal to allow the lower social class has their own subjectivity. They can receive our culture, but they are not allowed to create their own culture. That's why I say, imagine the workers' chorus singing the Chinese song on the stage, or to the motherland. See what that inspired for the Chinese working class.
Thank you for your talk. I think you might have stopped just where it was getting very exciting.
Okay. I didn't plan this. I just thought, oh my gosh, it's so long.
I have two questions / comments. One deals with this idea of resistance or from below, and actually a discussion of Chinese civil society, perhaps, because at one point you mentioned. Okay, so the case of Chile and China might be a case where you have export-led economy that is simultaneously confounded by all the problems of inequality and strictures of inequality that are increased. But in the case of Korea, or I should say South Korea, you have a period in the post-war, and post-war I mean post-Korean War in 1953, but from the first to the fifth republics, from 1948 to 1993, you have a time when the country went from 200 in GNP to the 12th largest economy in the world, and at the same time there was a democratization movement that created for a civil society and a public sphere that engaged in, for example, the creation of people's newspapers, and I'm sure some of you have seen images from the 80s with the student protests, and even now with the whole recent nation-to-nation talk between U.S. and South Korea importing American beef, for example, and how South Koreans are not eating beef right now. So you have this very huge resistance and democratization movement that has created for a very splendid civil society. Kind of against the kind of two cases that we've talked about here today. So, and I know that this idea of civil society is something that, my professors at UCLA, for example, Philip Kwong has written a book about the third sphere, in which he talks about civil society in the 19th century. So let's, there's a historical precedence of the Taiping Rebellion, the Boxer Rebellion, and so how does that kind of talk to your discussion about popular resistance from below, as well as, you had one point you said, the poor don't have a discourse, but I don't know if I forget how you said that, but I'm a little questioning that kind of that. And then the other second question actually has to do with a question I thought about during Andrew Ross's presentation, which is this kind of going back and reinserting Confucianism and Confucius, and can Confucius save China? And I remember in Andy Ross's paper that I read, there's this one question: can the PRC be creative? Because he cites the Confucian ethos. And in my first 3 years of grad school, there was a very large academic forum, which then became a book about Confucianism and the reinvention and the reuses and the misuses and abuses of Confucianism.
Right.
And this brought together scholars from Vietnam, China, Korea, and the Japan. And so the whole initiative, when I first got to grad school, was about this crazy exploitation of Confucianism, because every single time Confucianism is reinvoked, just like when Confucius was writing, is a time of chaos, disorder, and incredible instability and insecurity. And in this case, you're using Confucius. How are you using it? I mean, Confucius is about relationships and loyalty and filiality and virtue. Are we using it in this kind of traditionalized fashion, or are you using it in more the nature and principle learning of Neo-Confucianism? I mean, I think the biggest lesson I drew from that particular conference and book is that you have to historically contextualize these terms that are so large and embedded in an East Asian field of study.
Well, your last question anticipate what I'm going to talk later on, because I'm certainly not one who want to essentialize Confucianism and selectively use it, because that's precisely the point. Well, Zhang Yimou get us Confucianism is not what I think what is Confucianism, or what other Asian scholars. So on that point, I totally agree with you, because it's the selective use. Well, the same thing, the party is selectively using Mao, Marx, so when you have a discourse that's so, the Asian value thing, right? What is the Asian value? So I totally agree with you, and I think, this is something we can discuss further. In terms of your periods, so I myself actually don't, in this case, I don't have a definition of Confucianism. I'm looking at how others appropriate that discourse and the selective use of it. So that's my point. I will come back later. And again, that's in your first two questions. That's so good, because I think your question has three elements. The first aspect, before you talk about Confucianism, one is the situation in Korea, because that itself, it's a huge topic that actually if that's, we can discuss as well, because the difference between China and the little dragons in Korea and Japan is such that, again, I want to bring back Torbis, I missed the Cold War, in the sense that the takeoff stage of Korean industrialization, Taiwan, all happened in the what? In the Cold War economy, when the U.S. has vast interest to make sure the Korean model, the capitalism outside the border of China flourishes. So you have U.S. provide single-handed, one-way access for Korea goods. You don't have the WTO imposing on China. And also, the U.S. allowed Japan, Korea, and Taiwan to protect their own industries while they were developing. So you have basically the Korean model of development is import substitution model rather than the neoliberal Argentina, Chilean model. Because of that, you have more egalitarian domestic, relatively, okay? Taiwanese society for capitalism is more egalitarian than Chinese capitalism. And so you have a more egalitarian capitalism, and made it possible under the Cold War framework. Therefore, you have a rising, more middle class, civil society, all that. So Korean capitalism does not have to be as ruthless in kind of exploitation as Chinese capitalism. So actually what's interesting is what inspired the Chinese reform era leader is the Korean, Taiwan, Japan, especially Korea, Taiwan model. But then they have their historical context misplaced. They think that they can catch up, but the catch-up model is problematic because it's a linear model rather than a structural situation. So you replace linear logic of catching up without consideration of the fact that the world economy is a structural relationship. That's of all the difference between, the dependency analysis, which analyzes in terms of structure, versus the Chinese liberal preoccupation to catch up. And so when the Chinese set up to develop themselves, they say, hey, the little dragons made it, we can make it. They forget that you are a communist state. And when the Koreans, the little dragons were developing, the US is helping them. And the US is not hampering in the symbolic realm abuse of human rights on Korea, on Taiwan. So that's the difference. And again, in terms of civil society development, that set the conditions for different modes of social elite popular contestation. But in terms of civil society, I understand you refer to Philip Kuhn, right? Philip Huang Zhongzhi, right? Yeah, because yes, he discovered SECT, and that's a different a question. I hope we can discuss over in the afternoon, because in the case of China, I found it more useful. Yes, third sector is useful to think not in terms of civil society in the kind of either liberal or Gramscian terms, but I tend to think about Chinese society as being activated in the kind of Polanyian sense. Karl Polanyi talked about the great transformation, right? The introduction of market economy. So he talked about society being activated, civil or not, whether you have, in the sense of, whether it's organized within a kind of authoritarian framework or disorganized. So my conceptualization, I've moved, yes, at one point I was very fascinated with civil society, its potential emergence in China. But now for myself, I found, the Polanyian notion of society being activated, organized in different forms, maybe not necessarily in kind of a liberal civil society framework, more meaningful. Social forces in China are being activated, but then they might not in your recognizable form, that is civil society form, because of the particular historical context. Actually, what I said earlier, now I realize, stopping here is not really good, because what I'm saying is Chinese civil society resistant forces are not articulating liberal principles. They want the communist state to live up its expectations. And so their resistance is articulating kind of Maoist language, which is not a language of civil society, liberal democracy. Of course, you have some of them, and the Western media quickly amplify that. But the majority population, well, you already see that picture of the neo household. Also, you have seen the picture of the leftist websites. Those are not groups you will call civil society in Western sense, but that's what the activated Chinese society is in response to what Polanyi described as the destructive impact of marketization, right? He talked about the double movement. So you have the counter movement nowadays being enacted in Chinese society, not organized in the Indian NGO framework. Actually, one time, Paul and I were talking about comparative advantages. I said in China we have sweatshop, assembly lines. In India you have NGOs, and the NGO sector is more clean because it empowers and mostly women. Actually, many progressive women NGOs working for example IT for Change. Those are NGOs, but they're middle class. Really, in Indian society, many of those founded. So we're talking about, transnational capital money, real capital, productive capital flow into China, create workshops, sweatshops. And then transnational NGO money flow into India because India is a democracy. Therefore, you have, in India, you have the NGO, civil society flourishing, whereas in China we have sweatshops flourishing. But then doesn't mean Chinese workers were not protesting, try to claim their stakes. Again, something I will bring back. On the point you talk about, one point I said the peasant doesn't have its discourse. I didn't mean that. I mean the peasant, because, my whole purpose say they do. But the point is in official media, that discourse of the peasants' critique or the entire discourse about the famine, what had happened, was not there, as composed to elite discussion of the Cultural Revolution, destruction of their lives and how urban intellectuals lost their heaven. paradise in the countryside. And I would say, for many people, there's no paradise to lose in the first place. So it's not like I say peasant doesn't have a critical discourse. It's the media does not have space for them.
Thanks, Dara. That's fantastic. We'll come back at